Today in the Daily Dose, the American 1930s. After the high times of the Roaring Twenties, by the end of the decade, a confluence of factors led to the stock market crash of late 1929, followed by the Great Depression to follow, including runaway stock speculation, international instability caused by the First World War, and a punishing agricultural slump. During an age before federal oversight or intervention of any kind, as the worst hard time descended upon average Americans, more than 9,000 banks had failed by 1933, depriving many Americans of their savings deposits, while the ranks of the unemployed climbed to 15 million Americans, a full 25% of the total American workforce. Lacking government safety nets, such as unemployment insurance or Social Security benefits for seniors, the consumer economy ground to a deafening halt. In response to the early years of the Great Depression, President Herbert Hoover maintained a hands-off policy that only worsened the nation's plight, believing that crazy and dangerous Wall Street speculators were responsible for the nation's woes. As more and more Americans lost their homes and farms to foreclosures and bank failures, shantytown encampments became known as Hoovervilles, named so as a direct insult to Hoover's laissez-faire response to the national crisis. To make matters worse, the Dust Bowl comprised yet another man-made disaster when farmers in the Plain States overtilled grasslands without planting tree breaks to block prairie winds, forcing 2.5 million Americans to abandon their farms in what became known as the Dirty 30s. Other natural disasters compounded the nation's woes, including the 1935 Category 5 Labor Day hurricane that ravaged the Florida Keys, followed by a second Cat 5 hurricane that tore through New England in 1938. Sweeping the presidential election of 1932, after Franklin D. Roosevelt took office the following year, he implemented his first and second New Deal policies to help a nation retake its feet, in his words, to wage a war against the emergency. Ending Prohibition on December 5, 1933, FDR pushed the Emergency Banking Act through Congress before signing the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, or TVA, which allowed the federal government to build dams along the Tennessee River for flood control and the generation of inexpensive hydroelectric power, followed by the National Industrial Recovery Act. During his second New Deal, FDR steered the Social Security Act through Congress, at the same time creating the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, injecting federally funded jobs for the unemployed, which in turn improved the American infrastructure through the construction of post offices, bridges, schools, highways, and parks. While the 1930s was an undeniably tough time for most Americans, the nation also took time to play as best they could. By 1938, for instance, more than 80% of American households had radios, with such comedy distractions as Amos and Andy, along with soap operas, sporting events, and the news, while the swing era and the jazz age took the nation by storm, with bands such as Benny Goodman, Fletcher Henderson, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington. Cocktail lounges and bar rooms flourished after the days of illegal speakeasies, while Hollywood entered its golden age with films like The Wizard of Oz, It's a Wonderful Life, and Casablanca. By the end of the decade, as the winds of war escalated, even before Adolf Hitler's 1939 invasion of Poland, American industrial might ramped up to produce the weapons of 20th century mechanized warfare, which in turn raised the nation out of depression during the 1940s and beyond, making the American 1930s a time of trial and tribulation for Americans everywhere. Today in the Daily Dose, the American 1940s. In a decade soon overshadowed by the Second World War, Americans looked on in horror when Nazi stormtroopers invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. And while the nation had strongly favored isolationist policies since the end of the First World War, after Hitler's invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France in mid-1940, on June 3rd of that same year, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the sale of surplus U.S. war material to Great Britain, followed by the congressional enactment of the first peacetime conscription draft in the fall of 1940. Less than 3 months later, America entered World War II after Japan's unprovoked attack on American naval assets at Pearl Harbor. In response, American industrial might pivoted from producing consumer goods from cars to televisions to building weapons vital to the Allies' war efforts, inspiring a national economic boom after the hardscrabble years of the Great Depression. With so many men fighting in Europe and the Pacific, women collectively known as Rosie the Riveter responded en masse to fill the labor vacuum, building weapons of war that would ultimately lead to a high-priced victory over Axis aggression. After Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, just months after FDR's sudden death from a cerebral hemorrhage, young men returned home weary of war and adventure, with a common desire to settle down into family life with their sweethearts, kicking off the American baby boom, which would last well into the 1960s. As Cold War tensions began to escalate in 1947, Americans learned to live under the anxiety-producing threat of mutually assured nuclear destruction, as the U.S. funded numerous proxy wars against the Soviet Union under a burning desire to halt the spread of communism. Television soon replaced the radio as a nation's preferred form of entertainment, ushering in such popular shows as Candid Camera, Howdy Doody, Kraft Television Theater, and The Lone Ranger, while Hollywood ruled the box office with hits like Citizen Kane, The Quiet One, and a literal conga line of movies spawned by the Second World War. Swing remained a dominant mainstay on the American music scene, led by musicians such as Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Frank Sinatra, and Artie Shaw, making the American 1940s a time of sacrifice and renewal after a decade of crushing deprivation. Today in the Daily Dose, the American 1950s. After the hardscrabble days of the Great Depression, America's all-in can-do commitment to winning the war against tyranny brought about a time of booming prosperity, prompting former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to proclaim that America at this moment stands at the summit of the world. Soldiers who had survived World War II returned home weary of adventure, with a unified desire to settle down into family life with their sweethearts, igniting a baby boom in the 1950s that recorded roughly 4 million births each and every year. The post-war economy boomed as well, kicking off a golden age of American capitalism that saw the doubling of America's gross national product from 1946 to 1960, flooding a burgeoning middle class with consumer goods and revolutionary home appliances like never before. Fueled by low-cost mortgages backed by the GI Bill, young couples flocked to new tract suburbs built by developers such as William Levitt, collectively earning the nicknames Fertility Valley and the Rabbit Hutch in light of the ongoing baby boom. The decade also witnessed a steady rise in Cold War tensions as Americans fretted over the perceived spread of communism by one-time war ally the Soviet Union, leading to the rise of McCarthyism and the Red Scare of the 1950s, which prompted Congress to hold 84 hearings on un-American activities from 1945 to 1952. No one was immune from congressional scrutiny, including federal workers, university professors, Hollywood, and the military, in the end failing to uncover much treasonous activity, yet causing tens of thousands of Americans to lose their jobs, families, and friends. Civil rights also came into focus when the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education declared that separate educational facilities for blacks and whites was inherently unequal, leading 100 Southern congressmen to sign the Southern Manifesto 2 years later, affirming their staunch defense of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation in the South. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a city bus for a white person, igniting a 13-month boycott by Montgomery, Alabama blacks after Parks was arrested for her show of nonviolent resistance. The decade also saw the birth of rock and roll, as a new sound swept the nation by music icons such as Elvis Presley, Sam Cooke, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and Fats Domino. Young people danced to the Platters and the Drifters, while musicians like Jerry Lee Lewis pioneered the rockabilly sound. Known as the Day the Music Died, on February 3, 1954, a nation mourned the tragic loss of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. Richardson, taken in their prime by a plane crash over Clear Lake, Iowa. Television and Hollywood movies also shared the limelight, witnessing the golden age of television as more and more Americans could afford such technological luxuries, along with enough leisure time and money to escape into the world of Hollywood movies. Shows like The Honeymooners, I Love Lucy, and Leave It to Beaver kept families glued to their TV sets, while movie icons such as John Wayne, Elizabeth Taylor, Dean Martin, and Marilyn Monroe swooned the hearts of American moviegoers, making the 1950s a vital gateway for the 60s and beyond. Today on the Daily Dose, the American 1960s. After President John F. Kennedy encouraged a nation to put men on the moon before the end of the decade, the American 60s was officially set in motion 2 years later upon JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963. Already made anxious by Cold War fears of mutually assured nuclear destruction with the Soviet Union, Americans would spend the 1960s deeply divided over the Cold War-inspired Vietnam War, which saw 58,220 Americans killed in action, with another 304,000 returning home wounded, to an anti-Vietnam War protest movement that labeled returning vets as baby killers. Back on the home front, on May 22, 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson delivered his Great Society speech at the University of Michigan, where he encouraged Americans to aspire not only toward a rich and powerful society, but upward toward a great society, rallying the masses behind his primary objective of eliminating poverty and racial injustice. His Great Society platform would lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the creation of Medicare and Medicaid on August 30th of that same year. And while men like Martin Luther King Jr. would lead the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the nation would devolve into more than 750 race riots from 1964 to 1971, taking the lives of 228 people while injuring 12,741 more. By the start of the British rock invasion of 1964, at the same time, American youth embraced the hippie free-love counterculture movement, which clashed head-on with the mores of their war generation parents. Like-minded American youth flocked to San Francisco for the Human Be-In of 1966, where acid guru Timothy Leary encouraged the gathering of 30,000 hippies to turn on, tune in, and drop out. The Summer of Love was to follow in 1967, but by 1968, the American political landscape had once again turned violent in ways that shook Americans to their core. On April 4, 1968, while leaving the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. was unjustly taken by assassin James Earl Ray, while on June the 6th of that same year, after a speech in front of supporters during his presidential campaign, Robert Kennedy was assassinated by pro-Palestinian sympathizer Sirhan Sirhan, who claimed to have murdered Kennedy for his political support of Israel. Later that same year, Richard Nixon won the White House, while on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're going to be busy for a minute.
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Considered the spiritual end of the American 1960s, at least 400,000 American youth packed onto Max Yasker's dairy farm for the 3-day Woodstock Music and Art Fair, bringing to a close one of the most tumultuous decades in American history. Today on the Daily Dose, America in the 1970s. Summing up the 1970s, novelist Tom Wolfe coined the term Me Decade in his essay, The Me Decade and the Third Great Awakening, published by New York Magazine in August of 1976. The term described a general new attitude of Americans towards atomized individualism while turning away from the communal brotherhood of the 1960s. Many Americans, particularly working-class and middle-class whites, responded to the turbulence of the late 1960s, the race riots, the anti-war protests, the hippie counterculture movement, by embracing a new kind of conservative populism. Fed up with what they saw as soft underbelly hippies and whiny anti-everything protesters, they had also grown weary of a federal government that appeared to coddle the poor at taxpayers' expense, forming a political movement that became known as the silent majority. In some ways, though, 1960s liberalism continued to flourish in a growing crusade to shut down environmental abuse after the Love Canal toxic waste spill and the near meltdown at 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. During the 1970s, many groups of Americans continued to fight for expanded social and political rights, including the 1972 ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. Affirmative action versus reverse discrimination became a forefront issue in America's ongoing fight for racial equality, until a 1978 Supreme Court ruling limited the use of numerical quotas, but recognized that race could be used as one of the factors in admission policies for colleges and universities. The OPEC-inspired oil crisis of 1973 saw long lines at gas stations due to fuel shortages and gas rationing programs, while Nixon would resign from office to avoid impeachment due to the Watergate scandal.
Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
War ended in Southeast Asia with the fall of Saigon, while back on the home front, the fad-happy decade saw the birth of 8-track tapes and disco sensations such as ABBA, Olivia Newton-John, Donna Summer and the Bee Gees. On the rock front, bands like the Rolling Stones, Van Halen, Pink Floyd, and Queen dominated the airwaves, while soft rock solo artists like Jackson Browne and Billy Joel packed stadiums wherever they performed. Today on the Daily Dose, the 1980s. By the end of Jimmy Carter's one-term presidency, America's dreams of the 1960s had been beaten down by inflation, big government spending, and a rising crime rate, leading many Americans to embrace a new social, economic, and political conservatism during the 1980s. The New Right movement was driven by yuppies, or young urban professionals, and disappointed liberals known as Reagan Democrats, which in turn swept Ronald Reagan into office in a landslide victory. Many historians link the rise of the New Right in part due to the erupting growth of the Sun Belt in the southeast, southwest, and California, when scores of disillusioned Americans fled northern and midwestern cities to escape aging infrastructures, overcrowding, pollution, and crime. By 1982, the United States was living through its worst economic recession since the Great Depression, witnessing some 9 million unemployed Americans by November of that same year. After Reagan took office on January 20, 1981, he set about making good on his promise to extract the federal government out of Americans' lives and wallets, implementing massive industrial deregulation initiatives, reductions in government spending, and across-the-board tax cuts for individuals and corporations alike. Known as Reaganomics, the president's trickle-down supply-side economic policies fired the American economy, making the decade a prosperous one for most Americans, at the same time tripling the national debt during Reagan's 2 terms in office. Despite such a massive increase in national debt, Reagan left office in 1989 with the highest approval rating of any president since FDR. Pop culture thrived in the 1980s, with television shows like 30-something and movies like The Big Chill and Bright Lights, Big City, which portrayed a generation of otherwise successful young Americans who suffered from anxiety and self-doubt. At the movie theaters, blockbusters like E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Return of the Jedi, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Beverly Hills Cop took in hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. Teen movies thrived as well, including The Breakfast Club, Some Kind of Wonderful, and Pretty in Pink. By the end of the 1980s, 60% of American households had cable TV, making shows like MTV an American staple, as it aired music videos by artists such as Duran Duran, Culture Club, Madonna, and Michael Jackson. At the same time, heavy metal acts like Metallica and Guns N' Roses gave expression to a sense of malaise, pandemic among many young Americans, particularly young men, making the 1980s a time to remember for Gen Xers and baby boomers everywhere. And there you have it, the 1980s. Today on The Daily Dose, get your nerd on with The Daily Dose and learn something new every day. Subscribe to The Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.